in this video, I am going to create a background color, a new background color with a layer solid and a shape, and then I'm going to animate that shape. And so I have my composition here, and so the first thing I'm going to do is create a new layer. And so I'm going to go to Layer, New, and I'm going to create a solid. So when this opens up, it gives me options for the size of my solid. So all of these look pretty good. It's matching the resolution of my composition. If it's not, you can say match comp size. And then you can choose a color. So I like white, so I'm gonna keep that white in there and press OK. And now I have a background solid that is the same size as my composition. So if I grab my selection tool, I can actually move this around if I want to. I can scale it up or down. If I hold the Shift key while scaling, then it will keep its aspect ratio. One thing in After Effects that is different, well, now in Premiere and Photoshop, I think by default it keeps its aspect ratio or its proportions. If you in Photoshop and Premiere, but in After Effects, you have to click the corner pin, then hit Shift, and then move your mouse, your cursor, to keep the proportions of your object. So just a quick tip to remember: if you are getting frustrated by holding down Shift first, then clicking, and then it just deselects, that's why. So you need to click the corner pin, hold down your click, then hit Shift, then move. Okay, so now that I have a background solid, I have a layer. And if I click this little arrow down here, so you can see I have lots of options in my layers, in my layer panel over here. But the most important one, well, they're all important, but the one that we're going to use the most is this little arrow. And then it says transform. And then it gives me all these other options. So we have an anchor point, which is this little point in the middle. And for our purposes, for a background solid, we don't really need to mess around with that right now. That's going to be important when we start animating things. We have our position, so we can change our position over here. We can change our scale over here. And you can constrain proportions or not constrain proportions. I'm going to make this 100%. And we can rotate over here, and then we can change the opacity of the layer over here as well. So another thing you might notice over here in our layer options is that we have our time vary stopwatch. So we have a stopwatch like we have seen in other Adobe programs like Premiere. And what that allows us to do is add keyframes to all of these options. So what does adding keyframes allow us to do? It allows us to animate, or allows us to change parameters over time. And so why don't we just go ahead and we will change the position, or actually let's just change the scale of this white solid. And to do that, I'm going to click the stopwatch toggle, turn it on, and that just created a keyframe for me in my timeline. So the keyframe, when you turn that on, it will create a keyframe wherever your scrubber is. And so remember that you want your first keyframe to be where your change begins. So if I have my scrubber all the way at the beginning of my timeline, and I create a keyframe there with my layer solid at 100%, that is where my change is going to begin. I'm telling After Effects, I want the shape, this rectangle, to be 100% at this moment in time. If I move my scrubber 10 seconds down, or maybe even less than that, 6 seconds about. And I lower the scale here. It creates another keyframe. And so if I move my scrubber back and I hit play or spacebar, it will animate that change. So I'm going to delete those keyframes. I'm going to bring this back up to 100. Actually, just type it in here. And so it's important to know that you have all of these options under your layer, and there will be even more options as you add different things to your layer, like effects and other shapes, masks, and so on and so forth. And then B, you can, any sort of effects or changes you want to make over time, you can do them down here as well with your toggle animation. You can change the name of your file if you right click and do rename. And so I could just call this my background layer. Okay. And you also have the option to turn on and off the visibility here. You can lock the layer, you can solo the layer, and if you had audio, you could turn on and off your audio over here as well. Okay, so I have a background solid, and now I want to create a shape. And so I am going to go to my shape tool, and I'm going to choose ellipse. So if I just click and drag, the ellipse will create just that, an ellipse. Now, if you want a perfect circle, you just hold down the shift key. So I'm going to create a perfect circle. And I need to go back to my selection tool to do anything with it, to move it around if I want to. So when I did that, it created its own layer. And if it did not create its own layer, it is because you were active on another layer and it put that shape on that layer. So that's something important to remember, that if you create a shape and you don't know where it is, it's probably on another layer. If you want a shape on its own layer, you make sure that you are not active on any layers. You can create your shape and it will create its own layer. Another way to do that is to go up to the layer menu, do layer, shape layer, and it will create an empty layer that you can then put shapes on. So there's a few different ways to do that. Okay, so now that I have a shape on here, I see some more options up here in my tool window. I have my fill and I have my stroke. And if you have any experience working with vectors, you know that your fill is going to be your color or gradient that you have inside the shape. And then your stroke is going to be the line that outlines the contour of your shape. Now you can turn these on or off and have different options by clicking the blue fill or stroke word up here. So if I click fill, it gives me options. I can choose no fill, solid color, or gradient. And so maybe I'll choose a radial gradient here. I can choose a blend mode here if I wanted to. So there's a lot of different blend modes. And I can also choose opacity if I want to. And I'm gonna hit OK. Now I have this gradient and I have options for this gradient. If I grab this handle here, I can make the gradient larger or make the white area larger. And I can also move where that white area is. So bring it up here and make it larger. I can also change the color by double clicking on the fill color up here. And so this allows me to change the color of my shape or of the fill. But since I'm working in a gradient, I have different options. So if you have experience working in gradients, you know you can control the colors of both sides. Basically, a gradient is two colors that are mixed together in different ways in your shape. So over here, I have the left side of my gradient, which is white, well, close to white. And so if I click that, I can change that color. something else. I'll leave it, I'm gonna keep it white. And then if I click over here, the darker color, then I can change this color as well. And I can move the midpoint if I want to as well. So I'm gonna click OK. I think that looks pretty good. And if I wanted to give it a stroke, I can do that here. So if I click on stroke options, right now it's on no stroke, but I can do a solid color, I can do a gradient, and I can do a radial gradient again, or linear gradient or radial gradient. I'm gonna choose no stroke on this, but do know that if you have a stroke, you can control the color up here as well as the width of your stroke. So no stroke on that. Okay, so I've been kind of changing a lot of stuff. And so I'm just gonna open up my layers panel a little bit larger so we can see it better. And now over here in my shape layer, which I'm gonna actually rename to circle, it's good to title your layers as you are working because you can end up with a lot of layers and that can get really confusing if they aren't labeled properly. So now in this shape layer, I see I can close all these down and I start with contents and transform. Transform again gives me the opportunity to transform it in different ways and to animate those. Under contents, I can find my ellipse. I can find my ellipse path, my size and position. I can find my stroke, which allows me to choose different options like the line cap, the line join. Maybe if I want it to be dashes or if I want it to be tapered or waved. I don't have a stroke, so I'm not worrying about that right now. And I have options for a gradient fill. So if I want to, let's see, where is my, so we have gradient colors. So if I edit the gradient, I can actually edit the colors down here as well. And so if I wanted to change, let's say I wanted to change the colors over time, I can click my time watch. I just added a keyframe right there. And then I'm going to move my scrubber a little bit further down. And now I'm going to change the colors. So maybe I'll change it to from blue to like an orange. And it made another keyframe. We'll see if this works. Yeah. So now my sphere or circle is changing from blue to orange over time. If I want that to happen faster or slower, I can grab the keyframe and move it on the timeline to do that. So it can happen really slow or it can happen really fast. Oh, that's not really fast, but so you can add as many of those as you want. Let's say you wanted to keep changing color over time, you can do that by adding keyframes and changing the color. So we'll just have it do it slowly over time. Okay, so I basically, in this tutorial, I created a background layer so far. I created a circle. I put a gradient in the circle. And then we changed the color of the gradient and we animated the gradient color over time. So now what we want to do, what we're going to do is actually animate the position and the scale of the circle. And so I'm going to go back to, so this is actually a good thing that I wanted to point out. So I have a transform option, drop-down menu under my ellipse, and I also have one under my entire layer. It's important to know the difference, and that is because the transform, the main transform under the layer applies to the entire layer. So if you have multiple objects on one layer and you animated the position, for example, then it would animate everything all at once. If you have multiple objects and you just want to animate the position of one object, then you go under that object in your layer, you find the object, which you can also I thought you could rename it, maybe not. And then you find transform for that object, and now you can animate the position of just that object. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure my scrubber is at the beginning of my timeline here, and I'm going to animate the position and scale. And so when I turn those on, it automatically makes keyframes where it's at right now, but I want to make this a little bit smaller, and I want it to come in from out of the frame and higher up. Okay. So now if I move this a little bit further down, I can change the position, and I can do that, just by moving it with my cursor, but I can also control it over here numerically. And then I'm going to change the scale. And these are vector graphics that we're creating, so they're infinitely scalable. If you do bring raster images into After Effects, they obviously are not infinitely scalable because they are raster. That does not automatically make raster images vectors. So that's important to know. And so now I have the position and the scale animating over time, and the color. So I can actually see, maybe I want the color to change a little bit quicker just to match it up with the position and the scale change. And I can see the keyframes up here for my gradient fill. And if I open that up, it allows me to move those. So I'm going to move that back over here and line it up with my other keyframes. And now as it's flying into the frame, it is changing color. Okay, so that is how you create a shape and a fill and animate the fill and some other options such as position and scale.